As part of the Templin Institute's ongoing mission to investigate alternate worlds, we've been tracking the exploits of the crew of the USS Cerritos, and I gotta say, speaking personally at least, I'm a pretty big fan. Sure, it's different from what's come before, a bit more animated, and I can't rule out the possibility that this might be some kind of alternate reality, like this one, or this one, or this one, or this one. But regardless, it's interesting to get a different perspective on what life in the 24th century era Starfleet is like. I'm also particularly interested in the new starships we've seen, the classes and types that often play second fiddle to the more famous and prestigious exploratory cruisers. Information on these new designs is still limited, so I thought it might be interesting to speculate a bit on the role of these ships and how they fit into the greater Federation Starfleet. Now, Starfleet does play it rather fast and loose when it comes to categorizing their starships, but the ones we'll be discussing I think fit into the following broad categories. I should say from the get-go that these categories are not the official designations of these ships. What Starfleet calls an exploratory cruiser, I'd call a heavy cruiser. What they call an escort, I'd call a frigate. And a 23rd century cruiser might be a 24th century frigate. The point here is this is just a quick shorthand on which to frame this discussion. Okay, so to my eye at least, when you're categorizing Starfleet, you start with the heavy cruisers, the ships that operate outside of Federation territory, often for years at a time, with all the equipment necessary to conduct a wide variety of missions, and the amenities to keep the crew going. Next, you'd have the standard cruisers, same basic idea, but with a little less endurance, mostly operating on the fringes of Federation territory for not quite as long. After that, you'd have light cruisers, still very capable, but likely not leaving Federation space for any extended amount of time. After that, we have frigates, which are noticeably smaller and probably spending most of their time well within Federation space and only venturing outside of that territory when other ships have made sure the coast is clear. And lastly, we have specialist vessels, which don't really fit in any of the other categories and are likely dedicated to a singular goal or task. Okay, so let's start with the California class, of which the USS Cerritos is a member. I think I'd designate this as a frigate, and right off the bat you can plainly see this isn't the most elegant of designs. Starfleet has the tendency to almost mash together different classes of ship, and it would not surprise me if this is how the California class came to be. The layout is a bit awkward. To get to the deflector dish in the secondary hull, you'd need to go through the warp nacelles, and that's probably not ideal. And the general shape just doesn't seem to flow together very well. I can almost imagine that the saucer section was being mass-produced for some other more advanced type of ship, and the California class was created as some kind of cost-cutting measure. We know for certain they've been in production for quite a long time across the Federation, and some of the oldest ships are beginning to fall apart. Very little prestige is associated with serving aboard a California class, and I can certainly see why. But you know, there's gotta be just a ton of jobs across the Federation where it just doesn't make sense to send a Sovereign class. All the nitty-gritty tasks that make up running an interstellar government. And for jobs like that, a California class would be perfect. I am reminded a bit of the Liberty ships produced during the Second World War. They had a simple design, were cheap to build, and had the nasty habit of breaking in two, but they could fulfill the role expected of them, and that was all that mattered. And I think an argument could be made that of all the types of ships to serve during the Second World War, the Liberty ships were most responsible for the Allied victory. And maybe the same could be said of the California, just doing all the dirty work that keeps the Federation running. But if Starfleet cut corners with the California class, the Parliament class is where they went all out. I'd also designate this starship as a frigate, but far more advanced with a more deliberate and graceful hull arrangement. I'd speculate that the Parliament class is destined to ultimately replace the California class. Now there's two interesting details with this starship. The first is that, unlike most Federation vessels, there are windows running the length of the pylons supporting the warp nacelles. This would seem to indicate some kind of living space in an area typically reserved for auxiliary or utility systems. And the second is that one ship of the class, the USS Vancouver, was described as focusing on complex, large-scale engineering projects. Now, some have interpreted this to mean that the Parliament class is a dedicated engineering ship, maybe one predominantly assigned to the Starfleet Corps of Engineers. But I have to disagree with this assessment. Starfleet does prefer multi-mission vessels, and I see no reason why the Parliament would be any different. Maybe the Vancouver itself specialized in engineering projects, but there's no reason to suspect that every ship of the class did the same. Next, we have the Osler type, named for the only encountered example of an as of yet unknown class. I'd categorize this as a specialist ship. There's almost no information on this design, beyond that it's unlike anything else typically seen within the Federation fleet, lacking even the traditional USS prefix. But I think what the Osler represents is far more interesting than the design of the ship itself. We know that there are several more secretive organizations operating across Federation space. Starfleet Intelligence, the Department of Temporal Investigations, and in the case of the Osler, Division 14. One has to wonder just how many of these black-painted ships are operating behind the scenes. Could there be far larger starships, or maybe even entire fleets that don't exist in any record? I'm not sure, but the Osler is an intriguing look into Starfleet's more clandestine operations. But back to the more mainstream Starfleet classes, we arrive at the Luna. Now, the most famous ship of the class was undoubtedly the Titan, under the command of Captain William Riker. And there'd been a lot of speculation about this class for quite a while. I'd personally label it a cruiser. In its role, size, and hull arrangement, I'd say that what the Nebula class was to the Galaxy, the Luna is to the Sovereign. According to some unverified sources, the Luna class was meant to be a kind of return to Starfleet's original mission of exploring strange new worlds and new civilizations after the prolonged conflict with the Dominion. With the Titan in particular, though, this doesn't seem to be the case. One has to wonder if the Titan alone was assigned more dangerous missions because of the experience of its captain, or if the entire Luna production line pivoted towards becoming a warship in the same vein as the Defiant class. Now, this just leaves us with the last ship on our list, the Obena Class. This starship is slightly difficult to categorize. It's definitely a cruiser, but whether it's light, standard, or heavy, I couldn't say. Outwardly, it resembles most the Excelsior class, but it's been extensively modified to incorporate a saucer section and warp nacelles more reminiscent of the Sovereign class. Its hull also seems much larger than that of an Excelsior class, meaning that this is likely a brand new design rather than some sort of Excelsior retrofit. On the surface, this might not seem to make much sense. If you're going to build a new, larger ship, why copy the hull of a 23rd century design? But I think there's an argument to be made here for just that. The Excelsior is undoubtedly one of the most capable classes ever put into service by Starfleet, operating for well over 100 years. When you're designing a new ship, it doesn't always make sense to start from scratch. It's perfectly reasonable to start with a proven space frame, one you can enlarge, modernize, and outfit with all the latest equipment. An example from our own world might be the F-18 Super Hornet, which, while mostly resembling its predecessor, is pretty much an entirely new plane. Or the Kitty Hawk class aircraft carrier, which was an incremental improvement over the previous Forrestal class. So why was the class given an entirely new name and not just called the Excelsior II? Could be any number of reasons, but likely the Obena class just reached some threshold that necessitated a new designation. Just boring administrative stuff. So that takes us through all the starships I'll be discussing today, and while certain others have appeared, there is still a lack of information on these types and only so much I could possibly speculate on. Hopefully we'll learn more in the future, and if my track record is any indication, everything I've just said will be proven to be entirely false. But until then, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you agree with how I've classified these ships? Do you think they fulfill some role within Starfleet different from how I described them? Would any of you actually fight to be assigned to a California class? Let me know in the comments below, and until next time, this has been a Templin Dispatch.